Hello and welcome to my capstone presentation. It's called No Such Thing as a Free Lunch, the history of Milwaukee's food pantries, food banks, and food assistance programs, and it's by me, Haley Jasinski. This is my introduction. It discusses some of the literature and the gaps that I found in it. So, what I found is that there's a plethora of information in many forms on food pantries and food assistance in America. However, much of it looks at the individual and community benefits of having these institutions, not their history. Because all researchers are investigating different questions and have different aims for their studies, it took a lot of sifting for me to find pieces that I could stitch together for my project. Many of the studies I found looked at the nutritional differences of children who had healthy, free food versus those who relied on processed and fast food, how having access to free food improves student performance, and how individual cities can implement strategies to reduce food insecurity. Although all of these topics are important to study, many of these publications didn't fit into the scope of what I was looking at. As I honed in on sources that were more valuable for my purposes, I discovered studies that explored how food organizations were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, national legislation that determined eligibility for assistance programs, and concrete improvement strategies for food pantries. Although food banks and pantries as we know them today have really only proliferated over the past 50 to 60 years, it was surprising to see just how many works have been published about them. Overall, I found that both local and federal government reports provided the best and most relevant results for my needs. Many of them have data collected by professionals in the field or higher level university students who have extensively experienced and researched Milwaukee's food system. I supplemented these reports with a few scholarly articles that devised theoretical concepts that I will discuss later on in this presentation. My study is unique when compared to what I found because it thoroughly addresses the history of Milwaukee's food pantries in tandem with federal aid programs and provides suggestions that should be implemented and things we've found out based on the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects. Next is my framework for this study. It has the research questions I'm asking and how I answered them. I separated my research questions into 3 distinct categories for both clarity and open coding. First, I gathered information on the history and founding of Milwaukee's food pantries. I wondered what the very first food pantry was and where it was located in the city. Just how long ago was it founded? Next, I wanted to know more about the past and present layouts of pantry buildings and how they have changed over time. What were the driving factors for these renovations? A question I found an interesting answer to was if the majority of pantries began as secular or religious organizations. I also wanted to see if they were independent groups or if they were part of a larger coalition. An issue that is often encountered today is a lack of accessible hours for food pickup, so looking at the frequency and times of food distribution was another essential area to look at. Lastly, I wanted to see if I could discover any funding and donation sources for these early organizations. My next grouping of questions regards the growth and evolution of food pantries. How have operational methods of these organizations changed over time? By reading various mission statements and talking to a few pantry employees, I hope to observe some shifts in organizational strategy. Additionally, the response to significant changes was another area to examine. The final question tackles the issue of moving to a new building and the decisions that led to the move itself. My final set of inquiries deals with the current state of food pantries and food banks in Milwaukee. A question that should be continually asked and that is addressed first on this slide is how pantries can best respond to today's food needs. With a rapidly changing world and the unpredictable manner of the job market, pantries must be able to analyze and alter their strategies at any moment. Also, how are pantries affected by the pandemic, and how did they respond to the increased community demands? Will people continue to use their pantries as a supplement to their normal needs, or will customers drop off over time? Lastly, and most importantly, this study looks at the ideal ways for pantries to serve the maximum numbers of customers to attempt to eliminate food insecurity in Milwaukee. I obviously couldn't answer every single one of these questions, and I'll admit that I may have been a bit too ambitious at the beginning of the semester when I was writing all of them down. However, I addressed as many as possible through archival and article searches, government documents, and individual organization websites. I'll start this section off on our next slide, where I discuss historical, social, and political context factors. Here is the obituary of Jonathan Van Hengel, who is credited with establishing the first food bank in America. Van Hengel, 83, a soup kitchen volunteer who founded the first food bank in 1967 with a truckload of produce gleaned from Arizona farm fields and citrus groves, died October 5th. Working in a soup kitchen in Phoenix, Van Hengel met the mother of 10 and searched in supermarket refuse bins himself. Finding edible, if not salable food, he persuaded a grocery store manager and then the manager's boss to donate surplus food. Soon, he and his helpers had more food than they could use. The excess went to missions, alcoholism treatment centers, and abused women's shelters. There are many important things to observe from this obituary, and one is that the initial food bank opened its doors in 1967. This was during the early days of food pantry growth across America, so banks were able to do many of the food collection efforts to reduce the workloads for pantries. Van Hengel was also a charismatic and thrifty man because of his ability to get grocery store managers to save their food trash for donation. These characteristics are commonly seen in many food bank directors, especially those who hate to see any type of food being tossed into a garbage bin. Two other essential traits of his were generosity and innovation. When the soup kitchen he worked at no longer had the ability to use all of his food, he connected with other charities to make sure that more mouths got fed. The history of Milwaukee's food organization differs from other cities in that religious groups form and continue to form the backbone of the system. The earliest establishment in the city was the Salvation Army. It set up camp in 1889, almost a decade after the group first came to the U.S. from Great Britain. They didn't have a great reception in America, but they were eventually accepted into the community as they continued to provide Christmas dinners and refuges for those in need. The Jewish Community Center was founded in 1894, but there is some ambiguity about when the community pantry was founded. It is a joint effort between the Jewish Community Center and the Women's Philanthropy of Milwaukee Jewish Federation. Similar to the Jewish Community Center, the Milwaukee Christian Center began in 1921, but also doesn't have a clear date of when their pantry operations began. After a gap of about 40 years, there was a boom of at least 8 pantries that opened from 1962 to 1979. All of these established their first locations during this time period, and some even expanded to their second campuses as well. The Salvation Army grew from their first location into 2 more buildings, making their emergency food reach cover over 3 buildings. During this time, the Hunger Task Force and Feeding America also emerged and transformed the methods of both monetary and food donations for local pantries. The Hunger Task Force began in 1974 as a group of parents that advocated for school breakfasts in Milwaukee public schools, as well as progressive policies to reduce food insecurity. In 1982, they held their first food drive as a telethon and gave thousands of pounds of donations to many nearby pantries. Their free and local slogan was born out of this first telethon, as volunteers asked for local businesses to give their food to the organizations for free. Since 2002, the Hunger Task Force has expanded its mission to be the statewide administrator for 2 federal programs, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, or TFAP, and the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, more commonly known as Boxes for Seniors. Both of these will be discussed more in depth later on. On the other hand, Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin began with a mission to reduce crop waste. The founders saw that there was a massive amount of slightly damaged or unbought produce that was being thrown away or plowed back into fields, and instead of seeing this as just the way it is, they saw it as an opportunity. Partnering with the Milwaukee Rotary Club, the first board of directors got funding and purchased a building to begin their operations in 1982. They expanded to a larger building on the south end of Lindsay Heights in 1987, and as part of the largest food bank system in the U.S., with over 200 locations nationwide, Feeding America provides many of the non-packaged and fresh foods for pantries. The final 3 pantries in Milwaukee began in 2004 and 2010. Good Shepherd Trinity Church is the only one that is just a pantry, and it runs when there are enough parishioners to volunteer. It has been temporarily closed since the start of the pandemic. The Good Samaritan Outreach Center and the Silver Spring Community Center are both holistic organizations that cater to many different needs. The Good Samaritan Center acts as a homeless shelter for men and also carries out a full-service emergency food pantry. Surprisingly, out of all the food pantries in Milwaukee, the Silver Spring Community Center is the only secular one. It assists with many components of quality living, including adult education, daycare, tutoring, nursing services, youth sports, and obviously an emergency food pantry. Because it is a fully fledged nonprofit and is not affiliated with any church, its staffing model and funding sources are different from the standard religious pantry in Milwaukee. Why was there a boom of over 8 pantries opening in the early 60s through the late 70s? There were many contributing factors to make this period conducive to development. First was the newly invented and widely implemented food banking model. After the first one began in 1967, food activists and concerned citizens in the United States adopted and adapted food banks for their needs. In addition to reducing the amount of crops that were plowed back into the soil, banks also streamlined the donation process for retailers that would otherwise be hesitant to give out products. It also provided volunteer opportunities for people who didn't know where to start when it came to combating hunger, creating a powerful workforce. This time period is comprised of both the Civil Rights Movement and the Green Revolution, 2 highly influential events. One civil rights group that had many distinct food rights pioneers was the Black Panthers. The Panthers recognized very quickly that keeping people hungry was a primary way to keep them away from activism. If people are constantly scrabbling to find their next meal and provide for their children, there's no way for them to engage in work for the Panther movement. That's why this group was the first to serve school breakfast and lunches, as well as free weekly food bag donations. As part of their survival programs, the Panthers forced grocery stores to donate under threat of boycotts. This method of collection was radically different from Van Hengel's, but it produced very similar results. The Green Revolution occurred from the late 1950s to the late 1960s and brought about many new agricultural developments, including effective pesticides, GMOs, larger irrigation systems, and larger farm equipment. All of these things led to higher crop yield. Because commercial food markets were not completely prepared for this surge in products, farmers decided to discard crops that they couldn't sell at a high enough price for profit. This is where people like Van Hengel and the founders of Feeding America saw their opportunity. All of these events combined created a desperate need for a radical shift in how America's food assistance was administered. As a positive externality, food deserts began to get filled in as pantries expanded during this time period. Here's my methods section where I look at how I examined my data that I collected. As I discussed in both my introduction and literature review, I chose to use primarily qualitative methods for this study. I began with searching social science databases online for peer-reviewed articles, but I wasn't really able to find the specific data that I needed. I began collecting information from individual pantry websites, including their founding dates and their open hours. After this, I utilized deductive coding to discover the documents that I actually needed for this study. The codes I used are food access, pandemic effects, future initiatives, historical government documents, and raw pantry facts. This led to a much more fruitful search, which was mainly composed of government and nonprofit reports. I was planning on interviewing 3 of the highest level employees at Frieden's Community Ministries, where I volunteer, but I was unable to get an email response from them. Their input would have been very valuable and insightful, but ultimately, I'm happy with the data I did end up finding. And here are those findings. Here's a few of the concepts I gathered for my literature review and the gaps in the literature. There are several programs that supplement food pantries, and their promotion should be an active effort by food pantry staff to connect customers to the appropriate programs for their needs. The umbrella term for public food programs in America is called the Emergency Food Assistance Program, as I mentioned. The first T in this acronym used to be temporary, but it became the word "the" with the passing of the 1990 Farm Bill to symbolize the permanent role of the federal government in fighting hunger. This program, which expanded from an executive order in 1981 and an act in 1982, was officially launched in 1983 as a response to cutbacks by President Reagan. He tightened the eligibility requirements for food stamps, and after hearing outcry from recipients who were formerly eligible and anti-hunger advocates, he introduced this program to assist food banks. Over 7 years, from 1981 to 1989, dairy products, flour, cornmeal, honey, and other government commodities were given out through local sources. After these food stocks were almost depleted in 1988, these products and more fresh foods were channeled through food banks. Similar to soup kitchens and food charities during the Great Depression, the TFAP giveaways attempted to alleviate the lasting and damaging effects of poverty. Similar to how TFAP is an umbrella term, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, or EFAP, is an umbrella term for private food aid programs. The two acronyms are commonly used interchangeably, as there's only a slight difference between them, but EFAP is government funds that are given to food pantries and private soup kitchens versus programs like food stamps and school lunches that are directly paid for by the government through TFAP. The first TFAP program I will discuss is one of the most widely known ones, and it's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, previously known as food stamps. It began during the Great Depression, but changed names to SNAP in 2008. After completing an application and interview about their finances, an applicant may receive an electronic benefits transfer card, or EBT card, that is reloaded monthly with an allotted sum of money. Many factors are taken into account for the amount put onto EBT cards other than monthly income. Some of them are certain resources held by the applicant, like cash or assets that can be converted to cash, if an applicant receives disability payments or is caring for an incapacitated person, if they're pregnant, or if they are unable to work. Annually, this program serves over 40,000 people by giving away over $63 billion, and that was in 2017. The next program is called the Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, or WIC. It began in 1974 before TFAP was officially named. It is an additional bonus that can be stacked on top of SNAP for pregnant mothers and younger families, so the children have to be age 5 or under. The food provided through this program is more specific than SNAP because it caters to childbearing women and kids who need lots of nutrients. Some examples of these foods are iron-fortified infant formula, produce with lots of vitamin C, and whole grain products. This program also offers resources beyond food, like breastfeeding counseling, referrals for children to get their shots, and substance abuse programs. Both SNAP and WIC are integral to fighting food insecurity, but there are many misconceptions about who is eligible for them, which is something that can definitely be improved. The third program is the National School Lunch Program, and it was created in 1946 by President Truman and has greatly expanded over the years, possibly due to the influence of the Black Panther and their lunch and breakfast handouts. Both public and nonprofit private schools are eligible for funding and federal food, as well as after-school programs and child care places like daycares. In 2016, over 30 million children benefited from this program, and those who qualify are those who already use SNAP or are part of a Head Start program, as well as foster kids, the homeless, and migrants. Free lunches are for those with incomes at or below 130% of this poverty level, while reduced lunches are for those between 130 and 185% of the poverty level. The final program I will discuss is the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, or the Senior Box Program. These boxes went out to almost 680,000 seniors in 2018, and they are eligible if they make 130% of the poverty level or less. The U.S. Food and Nutrition Service distributes food and funds to states and tribes, who then get it to the suitable organizations for packaging and giveaway. As of 2018, only 5 tribes participate in this program, and others opt to use the FDPIR, a program solely used for Native American reservations. The final national piece I'd like to touch on is the Federal Research and Action Committee, or FRAC. They are not directly affiliated with the federal government, but they're one of the most powerful lobbying groups for food justice. They were founded in 1970, and their first major win was a lawsuit against 26 states that didn't have a food stamp program at all. This eventually led to legislation that requires every county and state to have some sort of EBT food card or direct commodity giveaway program. They have been pursuing other legal issues through these avenues, in addition to releasing reports about health disparities as a result of income differences. Their 1984 publication, titled The Widening Gap, described the difference in black and white infant mortality rates in the U.S., which was a result of thick injustice. Poor mothers were not able to access quality infant formula, prenatal care, or other essential healthcare components. Bringing this knowledge into the public eye led to a massive expansion of the WIC program. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, FRAC had a major focus on improving the school lunch program, which eventually included school breakfasts for institutions with a high number of students in poverty. In the 2000s, many of their causes advocated for immigrant rights to be on food stamps and be eligible for them. Their most recent campaigns involved enhancing summer meal programs and increasing minimum benefit levels for several food programs. A Plan of Action to End Hunger in America was one of their most influential reports ever released. It was published in 2015 and provides suggestions for governments and NGOs to end food insecurity. They include increasing wages and job opportunities, as well as sharing prosperity, boosting political participation, and improving federal programs for low-income families. This organization has been one of the most vital forces in this cause that doesn't directly distribute or coordinate actual physical food. The last key concept is the general trend in America's emergency food organizations. The vast majority of them are 501c3 and are exempt from taxes. This correlates to the fact that almost 70% of these places are religious or faith-based. In Milwaukee, this stat is even higher. 82% of all food organizations are religious, and a staggering 93% of all pantries are. All emergency food organizations in the nation are heavily dependent on volunteer labor, and the majority of their products come from private donations, federal commodities, and purchases. Finally, many pantries put restrictions on who can visit them and how often they can. Two of the biggest barriers for customers are zip code limits and odd distribution times. For example, the Salvation Army Cold Spring Corps in Greenfield only serves the 53221 zip code for 2 hours a week. There's only one other pantry in this entire zip code, and many pantries outside of this area do not serve residents within this zip code. Transportation to any of these other pantries can be a struggle as well, especially when there are several grocery bags involved. As I've detailed already, there is a spatial hierarchy of food organizations. The federal level deals with legislation involving food assistance programs and gives funding and commodities directly to states and tribes. State and regional groups receive these federal donations and package them accordingly, and these groups include food banks, tribal receiving locations, and state governments. They're akin to wholesale stores. The local level has agencies that get food directly to people who need it, and this level consists of pantries, soup kitchens, and emergency and homeless shelters. Many of them are required to meet standards set by food banks if they want to give away commodity boxes for seniors or receive funding from the banks. Here's a map of all the actors involved in an individual generic pantry. There's the food pantry customers who visit various locations and take stock off of the shelves, and the number of clients often correlates to the funding amounts that a pantry can receive. The food pantry staff is the brains of the operation and manages all affairs and coordinates people and events. Food pantry volunteers do the extra work where staff can't fill in, and they work for free to save organizations money. Funding sources provide monetary resources for food pantry operations, and food donations provide product for pantries and sometimes get a tax write-off. The majority of workers at food pantries are volunteers, and they outnumber paid staff greatly. There's an 8-to-1 volunteer to staff ratio. The average American volunteer puts in 51 hours a year, which equates to a total of $11 million worth of time and labor. I've included a map of all of Milwaukee's pantry locations. Only one of them is not operating out of its original site. St. Benedict's original complex was razed when I-43 was constructed, and the church was forced to construct a new complex. As you can see, many of the pantries are concentrated on Milwaukee's north side, with the next clump in Walker's Point, in that area. And here's the analysis and conclusion, where I discuss the results that I found and future implications for food pantries. Having all these findings is fine and dandy, but what does it matter for us personally in the future of our city? Knowing how and where food pantries operate currently gives us insight into how to combat food insecurity. At the end of 2020, 1 in 7 Wisconsinites experienced hunger, and this increased to 1 in 4 for children. The food insecurity rate in Milwaukee County ballooned to almost 18% because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The crisis we're in the tail end of it greatly exposed the insecurities present in the food system and brought them to the forefront. In Wisconsin, food pantry use increased by 58% during the pandemic, and over 300,000 people benefited from this vast network of resources. Learning from the situation we've been going through means that we'll be able to do better for the next large-scale disaster or public health crisis. Even when things do go back to normal, which seems like never, but will be coming soon, we should still care about this issue, because it's something that our tax dollars go towards. Even those who are temporarily unemployed or have hit a rough patch can use their pantries, and some of us in this class will eventually, or have already, had to go to a food pantry. There are some very simple strategies that food pantries can adopt to work towards abolishing hunger in Milwaukee. As I brought up earlier, sitting down with pantry customers to demystify food assistance programs can go a long way. For those who don't have at-home access to the internet or are not digitally literate, some customers might not even be aware of a program that they're eligible for. SNAP has many pamphlets and fact sheets that can be used as promotional materials, and they can even be placed directly into food donation bags that are taken home. Milwaukee has a direct hotline for those needing emergency services. Dialing Impact 211 connects people to an operator that is able to get them to the nearest homeless shelter, free transportation service, food pantry, or other emergency need. Increasing awareness about the existence of this number may mean that someone won't have to skip as many meals so their child can eat. For those who have to go to a pantry that doesn't serve their zip code, 211 can also give them details for an alternative location. Also, many seniors are unaware of the existence of the Senior Box program, so dialing 211 and having food bank employees engage with low-income senior housing developments is another efficient and positive strategy. Although Wisconsin has a relatively strong connection between farmers and food banks, more can always be done to improve this connection. As long as there are still crops being plowed into the soil, there's still work to be done. Providing shipping services for farmers to get their excess products to food banks should be a high priority for state-level initiatives. When it comes to influencing policy, the Hunger Task Force has a citizen activism group called Voices Against Hunger. There are several subgroups as well, and the two that exist currently are for college students and the Latino population. One strategy to reduce hunger in Milwaukee is to expand this group to include more subgroups, especially in neighborhoods. Overall, this organization is a great starting point for anyone who might not know where to begin with policy or intimidated by lobbying. They provide skill-building training for members on how to write letters to government officials and local news outlets. They also ask members to testify at public hearings and go to lobbying events at the state capitol building. Speaking of lobbying, 3 bills that have been introduced and will hopefully become federal acts are listed as well. H.R. 1919 would amend the 2008 Farm Bill and consider being a college student a full-time job. It would exempt SNAP applicants from the 80-hour monthly work requirement if they are full-time students that are below the poverty level. S-283 and its corresponding H.R. 2011 both attempt to amend the WIC program by increasing the maximum eligibility age of children from 5 to 6 years old. It would also allow mothers to avoid filling out duplicate paperwork 2 years after having their child. So instead of reapplying every year, this would give them a chance to avoid the 1-year recertification. Finally, S-1270, the Access to Healthy Foods for Young Children Act of 2021, would increase funding in meals for K-12 students. It would mainly allow children another free snack or meal in daycare and create paperwork and consistency for standards to create some standards like between organizations, and those would be for the ones that participate in the Child and Adult Care Food Program. Thank you for listening, and I am so excited to see everyone else's presentations.